went to school mostly in Syracuse, New York, for grade school and all of that, secondary school. And then for college, I was in Seneca Falls, New York, which was a great experience. I was at Eisenhower College of RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology. Actually, the two schools merged while I was there. I had a very wonderful liberal arts education.
Mm-hmm. And that's why it was wonderful. It was liberal arts. I mean, that's why.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I think that being a humanities major and I was a comparative literature major, it just teaches you a dexterity of mind and a broad understanding of culture and history and the lives of people. And I just think it's just such a very special education. And of course, I went to college in Seneca Falls, New York, which is of course the birthplace of women's suffrage. And so being surrounded by the memories of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and of course Frederick Douglass lived nearby, and Harriet Tubman's home was in Auburn, New York, just 20 miles down the road. And and just that incredible history from the late 19th century America that of course is the foundation of all of our civil rights struggles and women's rights struggles and gay rights struggles that we've gone through over the last century, in which we're making so much progress on, and which are fundamentally about the ethics and the values of how we treat people. And that history is so intertwined with all the social justice work that is really the foundation of everything that we do.
How were these people or these historical references part of your life? I mean, I imagine there are placards and signs around the town, but how else was that part of your life?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination. I mean, I come from a mostly Southern family. So, and of course, I'm old enough to have been born in segregation, although, I was, a child, of course, when all the laws began to change. And so I don't remember it as, much as, of course, has been conveyed. But coming from a Southern family, visiting family in the South, as well as in the North, I mean, obviously the challenges of our country haven't been contained to just one region or one place. But, I think that we've experienced this in our lives. But in terms of my education and in terms of growing up in upstate New York, I think that it was much more richly conveyed as part of who we were. I remember at college, I took a lot of women's history classes. We had a professor, Rosemary Agonito, who wrote the book, A History of Ideas on Women. Many of my classmates were involved in establishing the Women's Hall of Fame in Seneca Falls. So it was just very present. And, it's part of our own histories.
Were you having conversations about these things with your peers, with your friends?
Oh, yeah. We always had conversations about this. I mean, it was one part of our education, and so it was part of our coursework. It was part of what we were. But also, when you are passing a home that belonged to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Mm-hmm. When you're driving, when we would go from Seneca Falls to, Syracuse for break, you drove by Harriet Tubman's home. Mm-hmm. It makes it very present in your life. I live in Washington, D.C. now, and so I live in a place that is obviously, very much a presence in the 21st century. But every day, you're walking past history. For many years, I lived at 800 North Capitol Street, which was also the home of William Seward, who, was, in President Lincoln's cabinet and who was the prime movers of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so to just live in that building and to walk up the stairs every day you're only, at that point, you're only 130 years removed from that period of time. I just find that to be a very rich experience. I've always been interested not only in history, but in culture and in people. And I think that, and I think it is partially being from a Southern Black family that one is always open to one's ancestors and learning from them and honoring them and respecting them. And I was very fortunate as a child. I had one of my great-grandparents was still alive, and my great-grandmother Elizabeth, I was very close to her, and I had the privilege of knowing my grandparents, with the exception of one grandfather, and my parents. And so understanding generations and having it all passed down to you is important.
So what are you doing now?
Now, I'm in Washington, and I get to work on a number of exciting things. I'm at FHI 360, which is a global human development organization, where I work on two big projects and lots of other things, of course. But I work on a project for the NIH, for their National Institute on Allergy and Infectious Diseases, where I run a community mobilization and engagement program called Beta Generation. And it's designed around educating communities about biomedical HIV prevention research. And there are a lot of misinformation, some would call them myths, about how research is conducted, about the purpose of research, and also just about science itself. There are a lot of people, particularly African Americans and Latinos, who believe that there's already an HIV vaccine, but that the government is keeping it secret. And that's a legacy, unfortunately, from when research was not always ethical. Even when people don't understand what the Tuskegee study is about, they now have this mythology in communities that, there are cures and vaccines for all of these conditions. But just like in Tuskegee, it's being withheld from poor people. And so, part of the reason that a group like PRIM&R is important in elevating the ethics of research and in communicating that to the public is so that people understand what science is about, that they trust science, that they engage in science, and that then they trust the treatments that are available to them, and that they help to develop the treatments that are not yet there. And we have a long, unfortunate history and legacy that we have to transform, or many of our communities will not trust the science, participate in the science, including taking the medicines that have been developed.
What do you think needs to be done to accomplish this?
Well, my group, we do everything from conducting educational forums to developing materials to creatively interacting in communities. The most important thing to do is, in our view, is to educate community leaders. And that doesn't mean scientists, doctors, lawyers. That means how do we engage the minister's wife? How do we engage school teachers? How do we engage the guy who runs the barbershop? In knowing how science is conducting, knowing how people are protected when clinical trials are being conducted, that they're not guinea pigs, that what their rights are, how the science actually moves forward, what an IRB is, how that protects people. And so that when there's a barbershop conversation and someone says, hey man, I heard that they're over there studying that on those people over there in Africa. They're just using them like blah, blah, blah. Or they say, yeah, I know they got a vaccine. They got it hidden up there and, up in Maryland in the mountains. That leader in the community can say, man, no, that's not quite right. There's been some bad things done. We don't want to deny that. But, there's this trial that they're doing right now. And, and people are part of it, and they're protected, and, there are people who make sure that everybody's treated right, and they're trying to find the vaccine. There's some information over there on the table. You should take some so that, we get it right, and that there's a value to understanding it and getting it right.
So how are you finding these community leaders? Is this a hard sell? Is it?
Well, sometimes it's a hard sell, but what's really great is when you see the transformation. I mean, one of the projects, one of the components of our Be the Generation project, for example, is that we have community grants so that community organizations can apply to us for, they're small grants. They range from $5,000 to $40,000 or $50,000 for a year. And you can apply to do community forums, to develop outreach events, to develop a brochure that's specific to your community, that educates them about the areas of science that our project looks at. And, before we began our grants program, a colleague at the HIV Vaccine Trial Network said to me, there's a group of leaders I'd like to meet with. Can you help organize it? And I said, sure. So we organized a meeting for him with about 25 Black gay leaders from around the country. And there was this one person who's a dear colleague to me. And I'd never heard him on this topic before, but he stood up in the middle of the meeting and he said, why should we be involved in that? Why should we be guinea pigs and all of that? And he had just such profoundly negative views about the research. And it was a real eye-opener to me, because this is a person who has a PhD in communications, who taught at Howard University, and so who, but represented a large cross-section. Because as we've gone to other meetings and conferences, I've talked to physicians who, when trying to reach out to them about this, will say to me, oh yeah, well that sounds good, but let them try it on other people first. And I'm not recommending my patients to be part of that. And what you recognize in that is that, particularly when we're thinking about race and culture, that people retain their histories, and this goes back to why history and culture matters. And just because they get a PhD or an MD doesn't mean that they disregard everything else that they know to be true from their histories. And they have to balance that. And we have to be a part of engaging in that conversation. And now, this person, this colleague, his organization applied to be one of our grantees. We cajoled him. We kept saying, this would be really good for you. And he did. And now is a terrific advocate, and even talks about, his own past. That's why I can convey the story, because he talks about his transformation, because it was the first time really that he had been brought in a process where there was an ongoing conversation with the scientists and the people doing the research. And I think that that's an opportunity that we need more of. There is far too much division between the scientists and the research are over here, and the people are so far downstream after a product has been developed, or they read something in the paper either about a trial that went wrong or that failed or something, but they don't know, they're not engaged in the conversation throughout unless they're fortunate enough to be a participant in a trial or right where the trial is taking place. And we need a broader conversation so that everyone understands science in our community.
What was your first personal experience with the concept of research?
That's a very good question. I mean, my own experience with research is pretty long. I was a very sick child, And so from an early age, I wore leg braces, I had severe scoliosis, I didn't walk, in a timely way, not until I was a later toddler. I had childhood epilepsy, so I was involved in different treatments, and I remember some of them being experimental. I remember the conversation between my doctor and my mother about, well, maybe this will work, maybe this won't work, we're going to try this. And so as a result of that, I had an awareness, I think, of the testing or research phase of things, not obviously the structure. Later, of course, in life, I think that prepared me well for when the AIDS epidemic started. And as my friends and people that I knew, as I mentioned to you, my focus was comparative literature, but it was dramatic literature. So all of my training was to work in the theater, and I worked in a theater in Syracuse, Salt City Playhouse, all through high school. And so, and unfortunately, the theater community was one of the first to be hit very hard by the HIV epidemic. And in the early days, there was absolutely nothing. And people were trying everything to stay alive. And there were, people would read that there was such and such drug that they could get from Mexico, and they were importing everything. And, and I think that for me, I felt that there were two solutions to the epidemic. Three. Obviously, we needed to learn what caused it so people could prevent it. But even before we learned the exact virus, we, had strong suspicion that it was sexually transmitted and started encouraging people to use condoms. The second thing was that we needed science. We needed, if we were ever going to find a cure, we needed clinical research, we needed trials, we needed investment in science, and we needed political leadership. We needed who was going to mobilize the country, and it needed to be elected officials, but it also needed to be community leaders. So it was sort of like we needed a march on dimes. We're going to get rid of it, just like polio. There had to be this real mobilization towards it. I left the theater and I went to work first locally in Washington and then nationally working politically. But to be successful working politically, I had to learn the science and what the science was and what needed to be done. Everything from, how we were approaching this. I had been fortunate. My great liberal arts education, my junior year, half the semester was dedicated to the search for the double helix. And so I, as a result, understood retroviruses. Wow. And, and I have to say, when you're sitting in Seneca Falls, New York, and this would have been 1980, was my junior year, sitting in Seneca Falls, New York, in sophomore year, sophomore year, reading The Search for the Double Helix, and thinking, this has absolutely nothing to do with my dream of being on Broadway. Nothing. But a liberal arts education, makes you hungry to learn the world, and that includes science. And so I found that, which was like a detective story, a great read. But when then HIV came along and when the science was being discussed, clearly I didn't understand it in a way that, someone with a, PhD or other advanced degrees in science would. But I understood the concepts and could translate those to other people in my community. And that was really helpful in getting people to, one, not be as afraid, to be more informed, and to feel more control of their lives, and to begin participating in the science. And, many of us, we volunteered for trials. People who were positive volunteered for treatment trials. People who were negative volunteered for vaccine trials. And, I've been in 4 or 5 trials, since the beginning of the epidemic. And that's been important.
Was there anything about how research was conducted that surprised you?
Yes. I think that there were times that, because I also served on IRB in Washington, and there were times that I was surprised at how passive the process could be at times. I was also surprised at how closed the process could be. And being a community member at an IRB, there was a trial that was presented to us by a major pharmaceutical company, and I thought that the trial wasn't quite up to snuff, and not only was the science not well structured, but that there were a lot of ethical concerns with the trial, and challenged whether we should participate in it. And I think that it was a group that the company wasn't used to being challenged, I think. And there was a whole flurry and series of conference calls that had to take place. And another doctor on the panel joined with me and saying, there are some points here. And because at first, I think it would have been easy for me to be dismissed as a community person. Now, I had a little clout of my own, so it wasn't going to be that easy. But I think that that has surprised me a little bit, and it reinforces to me the need for the community to be at the table. And I think that how we do that, is a complex process and a difficult process for recruiting people and getting communities at the table and really having them able to participate in a full way. That was one IRB, but I think that it was a learning experience for me. And so what it reinforced was the need, again, to really help people in communities understand the value of this work. And that's a large part of what we currently do. We educate people about what IRBs do and why they're essential. And we encourage people, if not to join the IRB, to join the CAB, the Community Advisory Board. That there are lots of ways to participate in the research to make sure that, that there's value for communities. PRIM&R has an opportunity right now, as it observes its 40th anniversary, to create a conversation with the nation, and maybe even the globe, about the progress that we've made over the last 40 years. Looking back at the Tuskegee study results coming out, and Tuskegee's just one example. Obviously, there are other trials that have been problematic. And then even looking over the last few years, as we've learned more about that era, with the Guatemala studies, etc., we now have the opportunity to really talk about how science is conducted in our world. What is the ethical way to go forward? And what have we learned from the last 40 years? Mm-hmm. And I think that would just be a wonderful conversation to have with our country. And so that people can actually see the progress, because there has been a great deal of progress. But what they can also, I think, learn out of that process is how they can be involved. I think that they can learn, what the good that comes out of science, and from having science that is done within an ethical framework. And and I think that, and I think that one of the ways we need to look at it is obviously using social media to create a conversation, having, video blogs, but also taking the conversation to things like the Huffington Post Live, where people get a lot of their information, a parade cover, 40 years after Tuskegee, those types. I think how we use popular media more to communicate the story is important. I think our conferences, our educational materials, all of those are wonderful, and especially in informing the field. But we also need to support the field and to expand it by including the public.
That's very interesting. We do a good job at PRIM&R informing the public, but supporting is it's a different notion.
Yeah.
How can we do that in the future?
Yeah, I just think that, we need to just have, and I don't think it needs to be many, just 2 or 3 regular popular communications channels. And that really, and then I think also, thinking about our media outreach to become part of the story when a trial, and there will be bad trials every now and then. There will be mistakes. But how we explain those mistakes and what happens next is what's really important. And to really be engaged in this is what needs to happen to make sure this doesn't happen again. And so I think that, we have real opportunity right now. And I think it's going to be essential because with healthcare reform and with more people being covered, research is going to be different. A lot of people have joined research trials in the past, not necessarily trusting research, but needing healthcare. And so we don't want people to participate in research just because there's that benefit of healthcare. We want people to participate in research to advance science and the well-being of society. And one barrier to that is either they're ill-informed about the purpose of research or they don't trust research. And the trust issue fundamentally comes down to, am I protected? Am I being used as a guinea pig? Who's benefiting from this? And obviously our job here at PRIM&R is to make sure that research is conducted in an ethical way, that people are never guinea pigs, that the primary beneficiary is the society or the people with whom the research is being conducted on. And so we need to really get ahead of the curve in communicating that, because the incentive for participating is going to change dramatically soon. PRIM&R is a very smart and adept organization. I clearly, right now, we're all in a state of wait, and really, because we're not quite sure what direction our country is going. And I think particularly on the sort of financial level. So we know we have a lot of debt, and we know that it has to be reduced in some way. How that reduction occurs is important. If what it means is that we're just going to slash the budgets of, our domestic programs in the United States, that includes research. And so, or if government workers can't travel, or if university, people can't travel to meetings, well, that's going to be a big challenge to our efforts. how we engage faculty to come to meetings, how participants participate in. We might have to do more online type education as opposed to in-person education. But then that also begins to fragment the learning process, because learning isn't just what you see in the textbook or what's in the workshop. It's the interaction with your peers where you then test out what you thought you heard, or where you talk about a common experience and how you worked through it. That part of learning is equally valuable. And I think that, as budgets are restricted over maybe the next half decade, that's going to be a challenge for PRIM&R. And I actually think that it's probably the most critical challenge.
It's interesting that you mention that, because almost every conference goer says that the number one thing they take away from the conference is the face-to-face networking.
Yeah.
Everybody agrees that the face-to-face component is the most important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, I think it's sort of like the situation that I talked about earlier, that my most surprising experience in being on an IRB was that moment when we had conflict or challenge, and it being an awkward and difficult experience. Now, I'm sure that's not unique to that one IRB, but how IRBs learn how to manage that, learn from that experience, I think is often also with each other. And I think that the more IRB officials, both staff, chairs, lay people, have the ability to participate in learning experiences with their peers, I think that it significantly reduces the opportunity for those situations to either, get out of control in the IRB, or to result in the IRB not being able to function very well going forward.
Well, the last question I have for you is, if you could change one thing about how research is designed, reviewed, or conducted, without regard to the need for resources or regulation, what would it be, if only?
That's a brilliant question. And I wish I had a brilliant answer to it. But I do think that the one thing that I would change is that I think it needs to be more public. And I think that obviously science is complex, but and clearly there's a whole lot of stuff that goes on. But I think that in each community where science is being conducted, I think that there needs to be a process in which all of the community can be more engaged that this is taking place and why it's taking place. So that when a new trial is launched in a city, that, I would hope that, every newspaper, in its science and health section would talk about new research in our community. Something that really brings people into understanding it better. Because I really think that that's important. I think that the thing that I would also include, I just think that the design from the very beginning needs the active participation of the communities that would benefit from it. And so I think, and that includes a much greater diversity of representation, both through all the way through the scientific process, from investigators to staffing to the IRB membership to the CAP membership and so on, because a great fear that I have is that, we can do the most ethically rich, conducted trials, brilliantly designed, that produce a great result, but if communities, particularly minority communities, are not involved in the process from top to bottom, the benefits of all that effort will be wasted because they still fundamentally will not trust the result and won't use the intervention that's been developed. And that is an absolute waste.